So take a minute to think about, as a student, have you ever been assessed in a way that you thought was unfair, and what made you think it was unfair? Most students say yes, but I'm going to give you the language to say why it was unfair from a student's perspective. And usually if it's unfair, it means it doesn't incorporate the 4 aspects of a good assessment, which we'll cover now. So to be a good assessment, you need 4 pieces to varying degrees. You can remember these 4 pieces by RSVP, but we're not going to go in that order when explaining them. We're going to start with standardization. So standardization is the idea that the questions, the content is the same for all students taking that exam or assessment, project, whatever it is. The content is the same, the grading is the same, how it's given is the same, so that you can compare across students. So you want to have it as similar or the same as possible so that you can compare and you don't have differences. Well, this student got to use their textbook and that student didn't. Well, you wouldn't be able to know who knows more or who has really mastered it to the level that you want, because it's different. Another piece that you need is practicality. This means that it's easy to use, it doesn't cost too much money to get or administer, it doesn't take too much time to administer or to grade, that you can actually use the assessment. You know, assigning a 10-page paper to every student every week might be a great way to assess their knowledge, but students aren't going to be able to do it well because it takes too much time. And then grading them would be a nightmare. It's not practical. So you wouldn't get the information you want because it's just too much. At the same time, with money, you might find a great project that you want students to do that comes in a packet, but the packet costs $100 per student. Well, there's no way that schools will find in their budget $100 per student or $2,500 to assess for one content area. So practicality is also important. Reliability is the consistency of the results. How consistent are the results? Can you rely on them to give you an accurate picture and an accurate evaluation of your students? And lastly is validity, which means you're assessing what you intend to assess. You're measuring what you want to measure. A common example for validity is a math test with all word problems. Well, you might be assessing their math skills, which is what you want to assess, but you might also be assessing their reading skills, which is a different skill, a different set of knowledge. So it can hinder your results. Validity is the most important aspect. If you can only have one of those 4, you want your assessment to be valid. If it's valid, it will also be reliable. So if we think about an example of reliability and validity, reliability would be if you got on your bathroom scale every morning and it told you that you were a certain weight and you were the same weight or close to the same weight every day. It would be reliable. However, it may not actually be telling you the correct weight. It could be a little off. Your scale could be off. So it might not be telling you the correct weight. So even though it's reliable, it may not be valid. It might not be actually what you are intending to measure, which is your weight. However, if your scale is measuring your actual weight, it's valid, it's also going to be reliable. It's going to give you consistent results, because I don't think weight's going to vary widely. So it gives you results that you can depend on and what you want to know, which is your actual weight. So if it's valid, it's also reliable. So validity, you want to be sure to measure what you are intending to measure, what you want to measure. That is the most important. So now that we've covered the characteristics of good assessments, let's talk about some questions about when to assess, how you assess, what to assess. Some of this that has been hinted at already, but let's talk about it again. What should you assess? You should be assessing what your learning objectives are, your stated learning objectives of what you want the students to know and be able to do. Now, how do you come up with these learning objectives? Well, one source, the primary source, is from those content standards, the Indiana State Standards or the Common Core State Standards. You're going to look to those, and then that will help you decide what your students need to be working on a particular day or a particular week or grading period. How should you assess? You should assess in a way that matches your learning objectives and your instructional strategies. Remember that curricular alignment. You should be assessing so that learning objectives and instruction match your assessment. And when should you assess? You should be assessing frequently and as soon after instruction as possible. You want to be able to maximize those purposes of assessment, to measure your own teaching, to measure what the students have learned, to measure all of those things, and to guide your instructional decision making. If you're waiting 2 weeks to grade something, you don't know if students what they learned 2 weeks ago and where you should go. So you should assess frequently and soon after instruction to maximize the purposes of assessment. This is a graphic of the assessment cycle to show you how do you work through different assessments. So we'll start with assessment planning because you have to plan it before you start your first assessment. Assessment planning and instructional planning go hand in hand. You're going to do those at the same time. You really shouldn't wait until you've already taught a lesson to then create your assessment. Your instructional planning, what you want to teach, how you're going to teach it, and how you're going to assess all happen at the same time. Once you've planned out what your assessment will be, then you give the assessment, you assign the paper, or you give the quiz, you administer your assessment. Then you evaluate. Remember, you have the measurement and then evaluation. So administration is the measurement part, and then you have to evaluate. What do the scores mean? What does this mean for their learning? Then you communicate the results. So you might be communicating with the students themselves, with parents, with the principal, administrators, with special education teachers, with other teachers. So you need to be able to communicate those results. Once the results have been communicated, after evaluation and measurement have occurred, then you can start planning your next assessment and your next instruction. So remember, it's informing instructional planning. So once you have administered and evaluated, you communicate those results, maybe even get feedback as part of that communication, so a dialogue instead of just a one-way, and then plan for your next content.